kind of sentence they could also face. Brock?
Well, Mike, there are a lot of factors that go into whether or not prosecutors will attempt to try the suspects in this murder case as adults. The real question, though, how realistic is it? And how realistic is that they will succeed? Wichita attorney Dan Monett says prosecutors will have to jump through a lot of hoops. First, Monett says it's important to remember juveniles are not adults, and only in extreme cases will a prosecutor ask a judge to treat a child as an adult. The prosecutor must file a motion, and the judge must find evidence that the community would be better served by the child being treated as an adult for the purpose of criminal accusations. Some of the factors the judge will consider include the seriousness of the offense, the juvenile's home life and upbringing, and their mental status. But will that happen? Well, it's hard to know.
Not every case is the same. Not every murder case is the same. I don't think there's any way we could generalize to say that, yes, fair-minded, wise prosecutors always seek an adult prosecution where a juvenile is arrested or accused of murder.
Monett says if the suspects are tried as adults, they could face life in prison. However, if they're tried as juveniles, they would face a minimum of 60 months in the Kansas Juvenile Correctional Complex with a maximum imprisonment until they're 22 and a half years old. Now, they could also receive both the juvenile and adult sentence. The adult sentence would be stayed, but if they do violate the conditions of the juvenile system, they would then receive that adult sentence.
All right, thanks, Brock.